Pardon the interruption, I'm Chris Gehrz. Sam, June 27th is National Sunglasses Day. When you're picking your sunglasses, do you tend towards fashion or function?
Why do I have to choose? Welcome to PTI, boys and girls. I'm Sam Mulberry. Chris, the course has now begun. Webisode 2, we're here. Picking up where we left off in terms of the discussion questions, students wrote about kind of their thoughts on online education. Any observations that you...
Well, I mean, I guess first I just want to affirm the kind of things you talked about, and especially, the legitimate concerns you've got, just most basically people have internet access where they're going, so I'm glad you're thinking about that. But it's the reason we do make stuff available ahead of time, at least half a week, sometimes a full week, usually up to the next webisode. So I mean, know that that's coming. If there's going to be some kind of conflict, let us know. But as long as you're thinking about that's great. And the second thing is just like, this is a pretty intensive course. It's pretty much daily work. It's 3 hours of work usually a day. And so as long as you're aware of that and kind of get a rhythm and allocate time to it, I think you'll be fine. I mean, the one thing that was really interesting to see was so many students were, based on previous experience or kind of their maybe expectations for what a Bethel class is going to be like, they're thinking about how do I have a sense of connection to other students. And we do have these discussion boards. We'll have another discussion board post that we'll frame for you at the end of the second segment. But I mean, this is kind of a concern we have with this class, right, is we don't have that small group time.
Right, and it's something that in the face-to-face course we have a lot of. So this is a switch. Now, I will say I did my first rounds of grading last night, and I feel like I'm already starting to get to know my students a little bit more. So I feel like we'll have connections with you, but I'm not necessarily sure. It's harder to foster that among students. Now, one way to do that is when we do these discussion posts, like last time, make sure you read what other people wrote, things like that. I mean, I think that's a big piece of this.
So, I mean, what we'll generally do, we'll have one of these per unit. So usually the way it works is the first webisode we'll have a discussion post. The second will be more of a review. We'll say more about that in a sec. So we'll usually say you can start a thread. And so there'll probably be like 3 threads for this next one. Or, and maybe even better in most cases, like especially if you're jumping in later in the day on Monday night or something, like read what someone else said and pick up on it and develop it, respond to it, disagree with it, agree with it, but from a different angle. If you're looking for that connection, that's the best way you're going to get it. Because otherwise, this is what's called an asynchronous course. It's what lets you do it at your own pace, that you can work ahead, that, if you work during the day, you can do things at night. There are synchronous online courses. We can't do that and let you work at your own pace. So that's the trade-off we've got to make in course design. The other thing we're trying is we have set up this other kind of optional board. It always strikes us that people get really interested in certain topics, and especially with museums, we give you a lot of rabbit holes to go down. But you might want to learn more, and so that's a kind of optional space. If you really want to be able to talk about things, maybe not freighted with concerns about what grade you're going to get, that's a place to invest a little bit of time. I don't think a lot of time, but if that's the way you want to engage with the course, that is a new thing we're going to try out. And you can suggest things, you can respond, and we'll see where that takes us.
I'll say one other thing in terms of the technology side of this. I did get an email from a student. I worked with another student about they were downloading the museums to a Mac, and they had an error that looked like it was a big error, and we were able to figure it out. So if you end up having those issues, you can email me and we can try to work through those. But the nice thing was the student was working ahead enough to realize, so she has time to do that.
And I think that's the one exception. So in the syllabus, you might remember, we kind of give you, some very basic things to check through. Please do all those things. If it's museum related, talk to Sam. He's our museum guru. He, I think, has seen a few of these. I don't know if they're kind of hiccups we normally get, but he'll help you.
It mostly has to do with settings on their computer, but on your computer. But yeah, we can work through that stuff.
They usually involve Macs. I suspect it
almost entirely. Yep.
Windows bias on your part.
It's because I'm a PC guy. So Chris, now that we're into the course, what role are we going to play here?
So when we talked a little bit about this last time, and probably it was more you and Amy talking. And by the way, you're going to see just Sam and me today because Amy is in Japan. We couldn't fly her in just for this.
I tried a satellite uplink, but
it's okay. But I mean, you'll see a mix of us as the summer goes on. So partly it's another way of maintaining that kind of small groupy connection to your professors, at least, if not to each other. I think mostly it's our chance to help do not just review, but kind of deeper explanation of readings, of big themes in the course. And so we've each taught this course enough. We kind of know these are moments to kind of check in. So for example, early on in the first unit, Plato and Aristotle. There's just a lot there. You've got multiple readings. They're complicated, important philosophical ideas. So it's a way for us, and you'll see this in the second segment, for us to kind of talk through this, maybe pull out a few teaching tricks that we've developed over the years of leading small group. So I think that's a big thing that webisodes are good for. I mentioned the first webisode in each unit will set up a discussion post. The second one won't have a discussion post. It'll be a little bit more focused on prepping for the exam, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's another piece of this is this will really be where we review. So, we'll dive in, like you said, Plato and Aristotle today. We'll dive into readings, but also it's a way to do some of that bigger picture processing. So some of the activities that we'll do on these webisodes will be, you, Amy, and I working through activities together, but in doing that, we're processing bigger pictures, processing connections, which when we start talking more about the test is actually a big component.
Yeah, and I mean, a final way now for you to connect with the course, it's also a chance for us to answer your email. We each probably, as small group instructors, get emails. Some of them are kind of technical things like what you mentioned. Some of them might be, I didn't understand this. Or we might kind of see a pattern in some of the responses we'll want to talk about in the webisode. So, I mean, that's the way we can also make this feel a little bit more live and a little less just, here's a course in a box. Speaking of the test, it is still, I think, 9 days away. Wednesday the 8th, I believe, is the date of the first test. But we thought we'd at least talk through the structure of the test a little bit in these Unit 1 webisodes. So 30 points on the test will be a relatively long essay. We think like 4 good paragraphs, maybe 5 or 6 shorter paragraphs. We don't give you that question ahead of time, but we do suggest a bunch of themes that are just overarching themes that you'll see showing up in readings, museums, and films. How would you suggest students prepare for the essays?
I would start with those themes and start to, I might even take each theme and first go through and say, okay, looking at the vocab in the study guide, which vocabulary terms seem to speak into that theme or that question, and do the same with the readings. Which readings seem to speak into that? Because what you're doing then is you're kind of creating a list of potential resources to answer a question that touches on that theme. So I think that would be one thing. And the other thing, I guess, even before I do that, is if I looked at the theme kind of questions, if any of those didn't make sense to me, that's where I would be like, I'm going to email my prof to, just because it's like I don't really know what you're talking about there. I noticed that in grading some of the initial writing responses, part of it is making sure you really understand what the question's asking. So in terms of preparation, that's what I would do. A big thing when you're actually taking those exams for the written part is, and this is true both for the exams and I guess for any of the writing assignments, is when you're writing about somebody who we have a reading from, use their reading, use quotes. I mean, let them speak with their own words. And it doesn't mean you just plop the quote in there and that speaks for itself. But oftentimes I say, start with a quote, put the quote out there, and then your writing can be me picking apart that quote and saying, well, here's what this person's really getting at, and here's how it speaks to the question being asked. So I sometimes think about it in terms of there's a difference between a correct answer and a complete answer. A correct answer, the information's fine and you're generally in the right direction. A complete answer is drawing in some of these specific resources, readings, details from the films and museums, those types of things. That's going to make an answer better.
And so here, think about the fact that you're writing a lot of response papers. You've already had a couple. To this point, Unit 1, you'll have a couple more before the test. In some ways, those should prep you for the essay. I don't know exactly how 500 words translates to 4 paragraphs, but it's a chance to develop an argument over 2, 3, 4 paragraphs, to draw on evidence, to use quotations. And so I think those are good exercises. And I would maybe just review what you wrote, because it's very likely that those are going to intersect with some of the big themes from the course. And you might be able to kind of revisit something you wrote about, maybe a quotation that you used.
Seems like if I was putting an online course together, I might want to draw.
It's very possible as we write that we would do that. I mean, keep in mind, this is an open book, open note test. Like you've got the reading packet sitting right there. You've got time to prepare for these, to anticipate things. That also means I think it's fair for us to expect this is different than you getting plopped down in a 70-minute timed exam in a classroom where you don't have notes. It's not unfair of us, I think, to expect that you're able to draw on those readings, to draw on those specific vocab terms and examples.
So I think another thing to do then is when you're preparing the readings, I might put a chart together which says hey, here's the reading, here's the key ideas that it's about. And then maybe here's the page number that reading's on in the PDF, because then you can, when you look at the essay question, you can start to go through that set of kind of summaries. And the summaries don't need to be long. Maybe it's 2-3 sentences. Say, here's the core of what this person's idea is. that's going to make it easier for you to draw on that stuff in order to do well on that.
One last bit of advice that Sam was kind of hinting at is, one thing we're doing, I think, with the first few assignments is just diagnosing to make sure you're getting the main ideas. Another thing I noticed, even from the very first assignment, was we want to make sure you understand the big questions of the course, because those are very likely to show up, at least one of them in the essay. You'll see them in response papers and museum assignments. They'll be in the exit interview at the end of the course. We want to make sure you really understand what we mean when we say, who am I and who should I be, or how do Christians relate to culture. And so if you didn't really get that, we have a short version of it in the syllabus. But also, that's the theme of the very first film. So if you did not really watch that first documentary closely, it's worth going back and getting that, because we kind of expect what we mean. That's just shorthand for who am I is about the nature of identity and the nature of what it means to be a human person and the nature of what the good life is supposed to be, right? And eventually it'll get us into theology, and we'll talk about sin and salvation.
So, part of the 30% or 30% of that exam is the big essay question. We also have all these vocabulary terms. Mm-hmm. How are they going to appear on the test? How do you prepare for those?
Sure. So, number one, make sure you've looked at the study guide. We'll have one for...
Study guide?
Yeah, well, hey. We'll have one for each unit. So, Unit 1 is already up, and then we'll add Unit 2 and Unit 3, and they'll look very similar and be the same kind of structures. Read the first page is my first piece of advice, because we tell you, here are the types of questions that will show up on the test. Here's how these terms are going to show up. And then, as you flip to the second page in the PDF, you'll see that there's a lot of vocab, but there are two different types. So if it's not shaded in, they're just kind of recognition terms. We want to be able to know that if you saw a one-sentence definition or description, you could say, oh, that's Pericles, right? Oh, that's Hellenization, something like that. Or that you could put it on a timeline. Or that you could know, oh, that's from Athens, or that's from North Africa. You could find it on a map. So, very quick, shouldn't take much time, especially in an open note, open book test. And then there are the shaded terms, which we call mastery terms. And we talk about this in the study guide, so maybe go back to that if the way I explained it doesn't make sense. Those are terms that we've picked out. And it's not to say the other terms are not significant, but as we think about what do we really want to make sure you have a really strong handle on that connects to the themes of the course, the big questions we ask that are important for cultural literacy. These are the ones we want to make sure that you can not only place on a timeline or on a map or recognize, but that you can actually explain to us who that person is, or what that event was, or what that term means. And the way we test this is not to just give you a list and say, now define a few of these. That shows up in the museum worksheets regularly, so you've got some practice there. But instead, we will give you pairs of mastery terms, and you've got to pick out, we'll probably give 4 and you pick 3, or we'll give 3, you pick 2. You have to explain the connections between them. You have to say, okay, here's who this person is, here's who person B is, and now, how are they connected to each other? And it might be like a cause and effect relationship. It might be they're talking about a very similar question, but come to very different conclusions. So, for example, Plato and Aristotle, we'll get to in a moment. And that's meant to really test that you have mastered those. It's very hard to hide, I think, on a connection question. You either know those terms or you don't, and it's very hard to fake that in the middle of a 75-minute test.
And one thing I'll say about that is, we don't pick those terms randomly. It's not like, here's 2 terms, how do they connect? But we have connections in mind, and very often they're connections that were laid out in the course, laid out in the films. We've talked about them. I think another way to get at the connections is to try to sort of think about what is the overarching narrative of the course? What is the story of the course? And that's one of the things maybe we can talk about in some of these webisodes as well. But if you have a sense of that story, that helps you see some of that causality. Oh, this event couldn't happen unless this happened first, or this person's ideas come directly out of this other person's ideas. They were clearly influenced by them and then maybe agreed with it or pushed that idea further, or were influenced by it but turned it on its head and disagreed with it. They're often narrative connections. Mm-hmm. And I think if you're not thinking about the course that way, if you think about it as sort of little discrete packets of information, it becomes very difficult. Okay. It becomes easier if you start to think about, well, what is the story here?
I think a couple of you, even in your introductory discussion board post, talk about wanting to master information or something, and get a handle on all the facts, and you're worried about dates to memorize. Number one, I'd say you don't have to worry about dates to memorize. You can search that pretty easily. But I think this is what Sam's talking about. It's as long as you think about these as little discrete, separate little chunks of information, it's going to be really hard for some people. It's just hard naturally to hold all of that in your mind, to line them up. if you think about it as a story or as like a web of interconnections, then some of this might start to click. And I'll say it's more significant that way too. You'll start to see, this is why that's so important for Christianity and for this idea of Western culture and how they relate to each other.
So the way you might do a web is you could start with the term, so any term. So we could take a term like Socrates, and you could say, okay, get out a sheet of paper, write Socrates in the middle, and then think, okay, what terms have we had that connect directly to Socrates? So can you think of any term that connects directly to Socrates?
Athenian democracy.
Athenian democracy, right? Because he's executed by the Athenian democracy. So then you can put Athenian democracy, draw a line there, and then keep asking yourself, are there any terms I can connect to either of those? And if your goal is to basically create a web of all of the terms for the unit, which it works, you can do it pretty easily. Yeah. And if you have that web, that helps you think about the connections. In fact, that actually would be a nice tool for answering a connection question, because you could say, here's the two terms they gave me, and they're often not going to be the directly related terms. There's often usually a step in between them, and that's where we're really trying to get at some of those bigger thoughts.
So this can be overwhelming at this point, right? But I mean, one of the functions of the webisodes is we will help to give you some ways of thinking about why these, especially mastery terms, are significant, how they connect to each other. That'll actually usually be tied to the games that we do in the. Before we get there, Sam, you look tanned and rested and relaxed. And
it's at the ocean, Chris.
Can you tell, where have you been for the last week and a half?
Yeah, we took a 10-day road trip. We went to Chicago the first night. We have family there. We had Lou Malnati's pizza, because you got to have pizza in Chicago.
You do. Yeah.
We went to Niagara Falls, the Canadian side. If you go to Niagara Falls, the Canadian side's the way to go there. You get a better view of the falls. Went to Cooperstown, New York, which is where the Baseball Hall of Fame is, and a bunch of other cool stuff. Then we spent 4 nights in Maine on the coast, in Old Orchard Beach and around there. So kind of southern Maine, and
sounds great.
Swam in the ocean. Yeah.
I understand dogs were a big.
It's actually interesting, and I say this, having both my children, but especially my son, is terrified of dogs. This is a big concern to him, and we kept looking up, like, this beach, there's clearly rules that say do not bring pets, and it actually says do not bring dogs, which is interesting. But then
cats are okay at the beach.
I guess so. We get to the beach and there's all these people with dogs. So my son just had we read all this stuff about just and unjust. It's a total justice issue to him about why someone would do this. But then I started to notice, man, there are more dogs here than other places. And where it got really weird is TV commercials often featured dogs, and featured people going into stores with their dog. And there was even a bank commercial, and I think it was for the Bangor Bank, Bangor, Maine. Bangor Bank, I think that's what it was for. And it talked about all their, what makes a good employee at the bank. And one of the things they said is they realized that even though they're not customers, dogs are welcome. So I think there's a weird Maine dog thing.
I think there is. Okay, so write in. Let us know if you are from the Northeast. I have to say, I spent a lot of time in Connecticut. I never encountered this.
You got to go further north.
North of Massachusetts, I think. I'd love to understand that. Professor Poppinga, wherever you are, I know you've encountered this in other parts of the world. Is there a Britain-Maine connection? Because we know the British like their dogs too. Speaking of Professor Poppinga, she can't be here, but if she were here, she would want to make a summer CWC to travel connection. And she has suggested a game we like to play, which is called Watch Your Backman. Is that right? Okay.
We've got your backman.
We've got your backman. I've already botched it. So we've got your backman. Now, we know that you've bought a copy of Backman, and we know you've already found it to be, dare I say, one of the best books ever written, and you are carrying it with you. And all the adventures you talked about in your discussion board post as you go to the beach or to your cabin on the lake or wherever you were headed, Niagara Falls, Maine, whatever it is, and you're lugging it around. You've left home all sorts of other things to make space for Backman. If you could, please take a picture of Backman with some scenic
in your natural setting.
Yes, and email it to us. We will show it on Webisodes, and we will chart the progress of this wonderful Western subtext as it goes around the globe.
Points go to people who go to the furthest places, the weirdest places. Yeah,
especially the latter.
That's right.
Okay, so we've got your Backman. So part of what makes PTI, these webisodes, so fun for us is we get the chance to play games. We're both competitive. We both enjoy sports. This is as close to sports as we will get. So there will be a game, and usually we have 2 different kinds of games that will recur. So we'll be doing something different in the next one. But in the first webisode of each unit, we will likely play something called Make the Case. This appeals to our argumentative conflict
That's right.
embracing natures.
So I have to ask, Chris, did you go to a high school with a speech and debate team?
I did.
Were you on the speech and debate team?
In fact, I was.
Oh, I was not. So this is like...
Oh, lower your expectations.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So you're now the favorite and nobody believes in you.
I will actually be telling a debate story later in this webisode,
Fantastic.
As chance would have it. So the way this is going to work is we have set up 3 debates that pertain to the first half of the first unit in online CWC. So this is our way of talking through a few of the really big terms, ideas, questions of the course to this point, but hopefully in a fun manner that gets your competitive juices flowing. So we'll work through this, and then you will have 2 roles to play. Number 1, you will vote on the winner of this. And take this seriously because our self-esteem rides in the results of this very scientific poll. And then number 2, this actually will connect to your discussion board assignment that's due tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time. So we have 3 of these. Sam has prepared a couple of envelopes. So should I ask the question first?
Sure, and then you can randomly hand out an answer. So we don't know which one we're going to
We have no idea. We are just that gifted as debaters. We can take any side. So question number 1, Sam, which was the better ancient political system, the democracy of Athens or the Republic of Rome? Are you arguing first?
Sure. I'll argue first. All right. I have democracy.
All right. Bring it.
All right. So why was democracy the best? Democracy is the best. Now we have to be careful here because the question said is the best ancient civilization, right? So this is not about what's going to work.
Ancient political system,
right?
I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be about what works best in modern day America. So I don't need to make that case. I need to make the mess for what works best in this sort of ancient context. And what I like about democracy is that it really requires participation. It requires many voices, and it's open to many voices. And I actually read the Pericles speech and Thucydides, and we'll ignore the second part, right? But actually, but even if we don't ignore, I actually think he's describing what the society looks like on its best days, or what it aspires to be. And I think we need to look at societies and sort of what they look like on their worst days, but we also need to look at what they aspire to. What they aspire to is an open society, a society that's based on merit, a society that actually goes out of its way to say we don't even want to have elections, right? We think people should be drawn by lot. We think people should have a say. Now I'm going to I'm going to point out some spots for attack for you. Is that not everybody has a say? I realize that.
What?
but I mean it is. I mean 6,000 people having a say in an ancient civilization, an ancient society is really pretty amazing. And I think it worked really well for the size that Athens was. And I would actually argue that one of the things that it does is it should sort of fight against empire. Because although the Athenians builds an empire, it's not really an empire. I mean, it's an Adriatic Sea empire. It's not like the Roman Empire, right? So I think it keeps things small and local. So I think that to me that's why that actually works very well. And that open society, the sort of the free society, the society of debate, leads to things like the developments of philosophy, developments in art, and it creates actually an openness for those to become not just things that happen. They're not ornamentation in the society, but they're crucial to the cultural debate and discussion in the society. And I think any society, any political system that fosters developments in art and philosophy at the scale of ancient Athens has got to be the best.
Okay.
I bet I know what yours is.
I wonder what mine is. The Republic, the thing of the people. Now, I know you're claiming this kind of populist model for yourself. Let's understand that this works very well for the Roman people, and it works much longer than the Athenian democracy does. Let's just start there. The Athenian democracy basically has, I'll give it a century, and we're pushing things here because it really is not working that well at the end. It ends up executing Socrates and giving rise to our term demagogue. One of the nice things about this open society whose virtues Sam just extolled is that if you are a manipulative, rhetorically gifted public speaker, you can wield the people and get them to do anything you want, and there is nothing to stop them from behaving very, very badly. There's a good reason that our founding fathers despised democracy. They looked at Athens as a cautionary example, and they did not want to let the rabble loose and do whatever it wanted as it could in the Athenian democracy. And then you've got the Roman Republic, which is what the founding fathers actually did look to. This is really their model. Something that did last for 500 years. Now, it also was falling apart. It was able to accumulate a larger empire, for better or for worse, right? But it actually functioned decently well for initially a very small city-state, and then it worked, somewhat well for a couple 300 years, because I think it better accommodated human nature. I think you're right. Democracy would work great at our best, but humans maybe are not always at their best, and maybe you need checks and balances. Maybe you need to separate powers. Maybe you need to have kind of levels of representation so that you don't have the immediacy and the possibility of tyranny and of demagoguery that a democracy allows for. For example, if a demagogue were to be elected to the chief executive position, he cannot do whatever he wants and fulfill any promise he has made to get there, because in the Republican system, he would then have a legislative and a judicial branch to check his power, right? And I think we can maybe see the benefits and the wisdom of that lo these many years later. The final thing I say is both of these systems are unjust by, I think, our enlightened post, our 21st century standards. They would offend our standards of justice. But democracy especially depends on slavery to work. The reason those 6,000 men from Athens can gather for this time is that they're men of leisure, they're men of wealth, who are able to delegate all the worst kind of labor in their society to slaves who are horribly treated, right? And I think we can't just dismiss that out of hand as if that's irrelevant to the functioning of democracy. At its best, if you've got slave-backed economies of leisure, democracy works great. For most any other kind of system, I think the republic is the better option. Okay, we should probably be more concise, or this is going to be like an hour.
I thought that really interesting.
Okay, do you want me to pick?
Question number 2, yes. So question number 2 is just flat out, who was right, Plato or Aristotle?
So you don't need to take a whole philosophy class. You
That's
can
right.
just watch a 5-minute
We'll
discussion on a webisode here. So I guess I go first this time. I like doing our Johnny Carson illusion, which is more and more meaningful. Well, I guess chronological order dictates Plato should go first. Here's why Plato is great. Sam is going to tell you that you can just kind of look around the world and see truth, and you should trust your senses. And you might pull out some kind of example like this is a phone, right? Because our senses will tell us it's a phone. If that's all life is, it's pretty shallow and superficial. And we'll be, as C.S. Lewis said, men with empty chests, right? People with empty chests is what we really should say. Where am I going to see the soul in this material, physical world? Where am I going to see love? Where am I going to find justice in this world in which human nature is pretty flawed, and we do need checks and balances? Do I just disbelieve that a perfect form of justice or love exists, that the eternal form of myself survives the death of my body? Where is God in a purely Aristotelian system? I mean, is there nothing that is supernatural? Is there nothing that's beyond the material world? As a Christian, at least, I think Plato is very congenial in that he gets us to think about the nature of the good as something that transcends any individual system. It helps us, when we deal with the flaws of the Athenian democracy or the Roman Republic or the American Democratic Republic, when we inevitably run into its problems, we don't have to throw up our hands and say, well, I guess there's nothing good and perfect possible. I mean, it allows us to think imaginatively beyond the flaws of this world. And frankly, I think there's a problem of being too focused on the material, right? I mean, I think Plato's approach allows for the flourishing of the arts, right? The flourishing of imaginative approaches to knowledge rather than purely scientific or cognitive approaches to knowledge. And so I will stop there because I'm just going to talk about epistemology. You might want to talk about virtue ethics or something too. But just based on epistemology, this really important question of how do we know what is true, I think Plato is something that's hard to get at first, but once you think about it, it really is a significant kind of claim that there is something beyond what the senses can tell us.
So it's really well put, but I'm not going to let you get away with that typical Gehrzian
flourish
of oratory there, where you tried to cast Aristotle as like an atheist, where Plato is basically a proto-Christian, is what you're trying to say.
Some Christians thought so.
But Aristotle, one of the things that I actually find moving as a Christian reading Aristotle is in that Parts of Animals reading. One of the things that he talks about is understanding the infinite within the world. Mm-hmm. And he has that quote from Heraclitus about, Heraclitus is in the kitchen and people, don't want to walk in there because that's a, perceived of as a women's space. And he says, the gods are present here too, right? And I think that's the approach we need to take with Aristotle. Aristotle thinks that there is value in this world. I mean, I think he asked some pretty important questions to his teacher Plato, saying, you have abandoned truth in this world. And Aristotle doesn't deny the forms. He just says they're immanent, that they're in these things, that it would be wrong of us to ignore the world around us. And he says there's actually a lot of truth to be found here. I mean, he speaks to those of us who have a scientific worldview, who say, like, we should study these things. I mean, he makes sense. I think there's a degree to which I think when you first encounter Plato, he's at first very exciting and interesting, and then he's like, wait a minute. What are you talking about how these ideas exist up there? Or what Aristotle is saying is, no, if you want to know about goodness, you want to know about good government, don't sit and think about and ponder goodness. He's saying, look at governments. Look at what they do. And if you study enough of them, you're going to find the form of good government. And the same with, I mean, I think his idea about virtue and ethics is so practical, right? He says, in part, he says, how do you become a virtuous person? We need to know what virtue is. And he says, you can find that by looking at the world. But how do you become virtuous is you start the journey of 1,000 steps with the first step is you start to act virtuously, right? That this is something that's gained by habit. Now, I work with, part of my job is working as a counselor, working with students. And I actually find myself, although I actually have a lot of love for Plato, I find sort of an Aristotelian approach to virtue ethics actually really helpful for thinking about how do you become the student that you need to be, the person that you need to be. Is part of it is you identify what that virtue is, and then you start to be who that person is. You start to act that way.
Okay, since you brought up ethics, I'm going to just point a little pitch for Plato, because we don't do as much probably with Plato's ethics. I mean, we give you the 3 parts of the soul, right? That we're not just our appetites, not even just our spirit. We do need reason to be this kind of charioteer reining in these 2 wild horses of desire for food and sex and all that on one side, and things like anger and love and courage and all the passions on the other side. I hear what you're saying. I do like what Aristotle has to say, but it does have within it the kind of tendency towards ruthlessly practical. What is going to work the best in this world? And I think what Plato would suggest is maybe it's worth stepping back and being contemplative.
Right, but you can't judge it just on it. It has a tendency maybe towards that. It's not that. I mean, that's I guess what I would argue is it's not necessarily that. And I think sometimes he gets a raw deal from the Platonists out there.
Okay, well, we'll see what the people think since you believe in democracy so strongly. Okay, number 3. This is going to probably settle. I feel like we're kind of even at this point, Sam.
That's right.
Okay, who's the better role model for Christians? So a couple of ancient figures. Am I arguing first again?
Well, whoever gets the chronologically earlier one.
So, who's the better role model for Christians, Socrates or Judas Maccabeus?
All right, so both pre-Christian figures.
Pre-Christian figures, another Greek, and then a little Jewish history for us here.
I have Judas Maccabeus.
So I guess I go Socrates first. Let's just confirm this. Socrates, okay. So this is not necessarily who's more significant, because I could just say, well, we wouldn't have had that discussion about Plato and Aristotle without Socrates. I think what we mean here is, this is an odd question. Like we talk about what is the good life, and I think there is a lot about Socrates' life that's admirable. There's a lot about this emphasis on the examined life. That, I mean, if you're coming to a place like Bethel, I probably shouldn't just gloss past that. You are coming to a type of institution that is not just about job training. It's not a Bible college. It's not just about mastering a single text. It's willing to say that there's something about asking hard, complicated, paradoxical questions and being asked them again and again, refined, and that takes time. And so I think that's a good model by itself. But I think because what we're really setting up here is there a good death? And what's worth risking your life for and giving up your life for? I can't remember if we talked about this in the film, so if I'm repeating something, forgive me, but early Christians, people like Polycarp, one of the first great martyrs in the 2nd century in I think, Turkey, actually look to Socrates. They see him as a kind of virtuous pagan, someone who, through no fault of his own, did not know the Hebrew prophets or the law or the Psalms, didn't know what Messiah was, certainly did not know who Christ was, because Socrates died almost 400 years before Jesus was born. And yet there's something about the way he dies for a principle but also willing to sacrifice his individual life, his security, his safety for the good of the state, for the good of the community. That was really powerful for people like Polycarp, or we'll talk about Perpetua soon. They really found that very admirable. I think it's a very hard story for 21st century Westerners to understand. And here's where the West gets really complicated, because I think we want to hear the story of the West of like, it's going to be the triumph of individuals who are self-governing, get to make choices. As long as what they do doesn't hurt anyone else, that's all that matters, right? And Socrates feeds some of that in some ways, and he gives us notions of speaking truth to power, or at least asking, probing questions of power. He inspires someone like Martin Luther King Jr. But he also wants to say is, you are who you are because you're part of a community. I am who I am because of Athens. It was like a father to me. It was like a mother to me. I risked my life for it. I benefited from its legal system and its political system. I can't just for the mere convenience of saving my life discard that, even if it's unjust, even if it's irrational, even if I'm being railroaded. I have to accept that that's the cost of being in community. And that's something we'll keep coming back to. Like when we get to the Enlightenment, we'll talk about this question of, are human beings inherently social creatures? Can they exist apart from community and tradition and power structures? And Socrates says no. And I think that's a good thing for Christians to think about, because I'm not sure you can be a Christian purely on your own. You are embedded in a community, and maybe you will have to die for the sake of that community. So I would say that's a very admirable kind of thing to at least ponder.
I like the one you got. Judah Maccabee's a little tougher for me, just because it's probably not the role model that I want to look to. But I think it's significant because he's in a different situation. I mean, he is looking at being a leader in the Jewish community at a moment when the very life of that community, their religious beliefs, their cultural beliefs, their very existence as an other is being threatened by sameness, right? By the sort of the power of Hellenization and a forced Hellenization. And Judah Maccabee does a very active thing. I mean, I think this is always a tension within thinking about Christianity. I mean, is Judah Maccabee sides with, there's a moment when you need to take up the sword, right? And you need to say, kind of draw a line in the sand and say, this is like we are not going to give up who we are. And I think it's significant because it likely if he doesn't do that, I mean, there isn't a Jewish community. I mean, because the forces they were fighting against were actively trying to do that, actively trying to eliminate not necessarily the people, but eliminate the culture of those people. So eliminate them as a people, as a distinct people. And I think you can think about somebody who, I'm not a particularly hawkish person, but you look at the Second World War and you think, okay, this is one of those moments where again you see a different context, but essentially somebody a group of people trying to eliminate that same community in a very different kind of way,
right?
So I think it's, for me, it's a much harder model because my inclination isn't to say a good model for Christians is to pick up the sword, but I wonder about in those extreme situations, and I think Judah Maccabee was alive at a moment of a real extreme situation, not just for himself but for that community, and the things that I would tend to say, oh, that's not a Christ-like response, like I don't know what the other response is in that moment. So to me, I mean, I find that as a challenging model, but probably an important one to be aware of. And I think we're better off as Christians by thinking about those moments and being challenged by that. If you're not particularly inclined to pick up the sword, I would say, like, the flip side is if you are, it's interesting to think about the model of we'll talk about Christian martyrs coming up, about Christians for whom, as you said with Socrates, embracing suffering is the Christ-like response.
I think that's a really good way to think about it. Like, maybe what you need to do, it's like a liberal artsy thing, is think, well, which would you instinctively reject? And pause and say, but wait a minute, why did that make some sense? Because I think you and I are both really conflict-avoidant people. We're not especially hawkish personalities, but But maybe because of that, we need to really take seriously
Sure,
so much
absolutely.
would be, right?
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
vice versa. Okay, so that's how Make the Case work. So
Very kind of somber end to that.
no, that's okay. This is a good start. We'll hone our debating
That's
chops
right.
as this goes forward, and we'll bring Amy into the fold when she gets back.
No more friends on this stuff.
So again, you have two things to do, students. First of all, please take the time to vote. There are no points, there's no grade attached, but we are going to put a poll up on Moodle, and based on the totality of our arguments across those three cases, who won, Sam or Chris?
We'll do them as individual cases.
Oh, you're
Yeah.
going to do all three?
Absolutely,
Okay, super. But then here's the thing that is actually great. Your next 5-point discussion post is a make the case of your own. So what we're going to have you do is go to Moodle. You'll find a discussion forum. It'll say make the case for a definition of justice. So, this has been a big theme. It runs through Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. You've already written a response to that. Now we want you to think about where you've seen this in a couple of the readings we've had you do from ancient Greece. So the three cases you can make. First of all, make the case, if you want, that Antigone's definition of justice from the play by Sophocles of that name is one that is most relevant to you as a 21st century American. And if you want to play with kind of how you frame it, that's up to you. But how does this apply to someone living in the West in the 21st century? So you can make the case for Antigone. From the same play, you can make the case for Creon. I think students sometimes think that Sophocles is obviously arguing for Antigone, and I like to have them think like maybe Creon is actually allowed to make a pretty strong case, and it's just maybe not the one we instinctively think about. So does Creon actually have a case for justice that is pretty applicable, depending on maybe what the context is? And think about that this was a society emerging out of civil war. So he'll talk about stability and security. And then you've also got this excerpt from Thucydides. Sam mentioned the first half of that reading from his landmark History of the Peloponnesian War, which is Pericles' speech about democracy. The second half is this encounter between ambassadors from Athens and Milos, this little island that is being threatened with becoming part of this Athenian empire in the middle of a war that it really has no stake in. And the Athenian ambassadors do give a kind of definition of justice. And I want you to take that seriously. So you might end up making the case like that actually is the most applicable in the 21st century. Maybe we see that version of justice showing up even if we don't like it. So read back through those readings, the play by Sophocles, which has two options, and then the Thucydides reading, and make your case. And here again, you can start a thread. We should probably have like an Antigone thread, a Creon thread, and a Thucydides thread, and then maybe like respond to what other people have written, whether to agree but taking a different direction, or maybe to disagree. And get that done by Tuesday at 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time. Okay. Okay, it's happy time. Happy birthday to J.J. Abrams. The writer, director, producer turns 50 years old. Can you believe
Wow.
J.J. Abrams is 50
Wow.
today? All right. Sam, has J.J. Abrams done his best work on TV or on the silver screen?
It's hard to say because what J.J. Abrams is really good at is beginning things and like
Yes.
asking questions. So like, it's hard to know. Was like Apex Abrams the first couple seasons of Lost?
Yeah, how much of Lost does he deserve credit for, too?
That's true. Yeah, it's probably
I kind of like
yeah.
fold Lindelof into...
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I think here's the thing: is I'm really excited that he did that first Star Wars movie, that he's going to oversee it, but that we have Rian Johnson, that we have Gareth Edwards, that we have other people doing the follow-up movies.
But he has handpicked these.
Right, absolutely.
Right? Like, I give him some
I
credit
think he
for
can.
that.
That's what I'm saying. I think he can maybe manage the product, but I'm glad that it's not. Like the first Star Trek movie was great,
Yes.
and then the next one was not.
Not so much.
So I think I'm happy that he's handing the reins over, or that Disney's handing the reins over to some other really exciting filmmakers for those.
Yep.
So happy anniversary, Chris. Space Shuttle Columbia, which flew its final test mission on this day in 1982. 5 months later, it launched for its first full mission. Chris, will humans live on the moon in your lifetime?
So here's my debate story. So in 10th grade debate, the first time I did this in high school, we argued a case on space exploration. That was the national resolution. And we actually had a pretty successful, we actually won a couple tournaments arguing that the only kind of space exploration we should do is unstaffed. The satellites they send out to Pluto and that land on Mars and all that. And like, that's cool, right? And it killed me. Because I actually am a big Star Trek and Star Wars fan. And the idea like that's where we would stop, just sending out, inanimate robots to go take pictures for us just killed me. I hated that so much. And so I believe that we will at least, in my lifetime, like as I'm dying, like we will get the Neil Armstrong of the 21st century saying, lights are on for business at Moon Station Alpha.
Okay, so this past week I was sitting on the rocks of the Maine coast with my son. And we were looking out at the ocean, and I told him it's amazing to think 1,000 years ago people sat here and looked out and they didn't know what was past. I was trying to explain to him frontier, and I said and it's crazy to think now if you look out, we know what's everywhere in that direction. Then I pointed up and I said, but that we don't know.
And
it was the beginning of a J.J. Abrams movie.
And Banks would do it, too.
Yes.
That's exactly what he is made for. Is he will design this. I took my kids to the Science Museum where they're doing the space. And, they had this thing where they designed, how do you make a Martian colony flourish? And they were talking about, where are we going to get air and water and heat and how are we going to grow food? And they were into it. And it's yeah, that's good. And, maybe we can do this frontier and this voyage of discovery without, the terrible injustice, genocide, and exploitation, because I don't think there's anyone on the moon, right? And we can do this peacefully somehow. We'll see. You're the one who argued for the best of humanity.
That's right.
Okay, happy trails to the 2015-16 NBA season. Sam, it's our first chance to debrief since LeBron James led the Cleveland Cavaliers to a stunning 7-game victory over the Golden State Warriors. I did. Wow. Any hot takes left? We're a few days removed from it.
It's all stuff that you've heard before, but the block on Andre Iguodala is an all-time play.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it was great. I felt it's funny because I went into the playoffs this is all about the coronation of the Steph Curry Warriors, back-to-back championships, and I loved it. I loved that OKC series. And as the finals went on, I started feeling I kind of want him to win one for the land. And it was great.
I was at war with myself. Aesthetically, I love what the Warriors do. I hope that is the template for every team, and I hope the Timberwolves play something like that style of ball. And then there's the Midwestern part of me that feels no, the story here is Cleveland, and the story is someone coming home and doing this thing, and this gritty performance. I just hated all these kind of adjectives that started applying, but that was. I also want LeBron James to kind of be able to write the ending to that story, and I want him to not have to make excuses for his career, because I think he's a legitimately all-time great player.
But we're burying the lead, Chris. One more happy welcome to the Chris Dunn era.
I think so. I also feel this is gonna be a pretty good year to be a Timberwolves fan. I was watching Twitter after Game 7, and at one point Karl Anthony Towns came out and he was talking about how LeBron James was just full of emotion bursts, and he wrote, "I want that feeling."
Yes.
And I want it many times.
Win one for this land.
Exactly. So, pretty good webisode.
I think it was great.
Might be a little more succinct next time. So, students, you've got lots of things to do. The one graded thing to do is to write your discussion post where you will make the case for an ancient Greek version of justice. Remember, that's due on Tuesday, June 28th at 10 a.m. Central Daylight Time. We also would like to have you vote on our Make the Case attempt. We would also like your... It's not watch your back, man. It's
we've got your back.
We've got your back, man. Your picture is, have you taken your textbook in any travels? If you can't do it for next time, just remember, we'll keep checking in and we'll show your picture here on the webisodes. Plus any email you might have, questions, things you're wrestling with.
Because the next one will be getting ready for the test. So.
Yep. So we'll be filming that in a couple of days. You've got a couple more museums as we start turning to the history of early Christianity. That part of the course's title. Otherwise, Sam, anything left to say?
I don't think so.
Okay, kids, turn off the iPads. We're done.